This program is brought to you by Emory University.
On March 3, 2015, the Office of the Provost at Emory University hosted a forum titled Managing a Public Intellectual Profile. The panelists examined the challenges and opportunities of creating and maintaining public intellectual profiles and protecting online reputations in an era dominated by digital media and social networks. The speakers were Cecile Janssens, Professor of Epidemiology at the Rollins School of Public Health, Julie Winch, Director of Social and New Media at Emory, and Tressie McMillan Cottom, a doctoral candidate in sociology at Emory. In this video, Ms. Cottom describes her many ventures in public scholarship from the perspective of a digital native whose academic career has paralleled the growth of digital media and social networks.
Broadly, my story of social media is that I was very much there, and I don't like this language, but if you do like it, being a digital native, I was already kind of there as a person as I was going through sort of the professionalization process of academia. So it was a slightly different process for me. I was not building it on the back end of a career. It was developing as my career trajectory was developing, which came with slightly different types of choices, risk, rewards, and all that kind of thing. I'm always happy to talk about that more broadly if anybody has any questions. But I don't know if that's the most interesting thing. So I will say that I ended up in those spaces talking about my academic research because in many ways that's where my research was happening. Right, so I was studying and studied for-profit colleges, is my most recent project. And so a lot of the sort of public discourse, particularly around public policy issues as it related to privatization and higher education, by the time academic research would catch up with it, I still wouldn't have a literature review. Right, I mean, truly, this is a thing that's happening, that was very much happening in real time, and I needed to be engaged in those conversations as I was trying to figure out my own academic trajectory. So some of that was organic for me. It was not about a choice of, whether or not I found it interesting or not. This was very much driven initially by necessity, and by the fact that I was kind of already comfortable on these platforms, right? I wanted to make a couple of good points that I would like to build on. Some of those being because a lot of the discourse around my research was happening in the public discourse. That's where I ended up, and I think some of the greatest benefits to me personally and professionally, and particularly as I've worked on developing a research agenda, has been those connections with people both in public policy and across institutions. When you're doing, it's very easy for us to dig into our area of expertise, and that is important, and it's part of the job. And public scholarship does not change that, for the record. You still need to be expert in your little corner of the world, right? But at the same time, what it allowed me to do was understand how my work would contribute to a larger conversation. And I was developing those languages simultaneously. And I think ultimately, while it is a different type of investment of time and resources, I fundamentally think that it was important to be understanding what my research is. Right? It is very easy, I think, for us to dig into developing the expertise and then have to step out 5-6 years down the road and remember why we were doing it to begin with and what impact it has. And then when it does come time to write those grant applications, the book proposals, develop a media profile for your upcoming book, and tour as increasingly academic publishers want you to do, then you have to remember. Right? One of the great things was I kind of had this constant check going about where my research was situated vis-a-vis other things that were happening more broadly. And I think Cecile makes an excellent point. I think it makes you a better writer, particularly a better academic writer. My academic writing became much better. I became more confident about writing in my own voice as an academic instead of parroting the voices of the academic ghosts that had come before me. You actually don't want to write like Weber, as it turns out. It's actually not as good a thing as we think it is. And I think developing the confidence to do that when you see what lands, as you, Cecile made an excellent point, how frequently I've been working through ideas on my blog, which is what I use that space for, and increasingly what I use it for, which is to work through sort of the early connections of ideas. To see what lands with people is very interesting. Right? What ended up actually being the hook for my book was not something that I thought was important. But every time I mentioned it, people said this was the thing they thought was fascinating, right? I had this little separate piece where I was doing this analysis of Securities and Exchange Commission filings. Who would care about that? All right, like I thought it was the most, I was doing of made sort of out of personal interest. I thought it was interesting, did not think anybody else would. Consistently, every time I brought it up, people were fascinated by it. It ends up being the framing for the entire book, which is in many ways driven off of a type of quasi-market research, right? For whatever reason, I have some evidence that this resonated with people. I think that having that sort of ongoing dialogue with various publics absolutely impacted not only my academic writing, but my grant writing success. Increasingly, I have found that funding agencies are impressed by your ability to use social media platforms to talk about your work. I increasingly put them in my applications now, right? That this will be part of what this grant will do and support. We had a grant with the American Education Research Association, and I actually wrote in a social media position into the grant and hired someone to do just that. And the feedback from the reviewers was that that was very important and critical to their decision. Right? Organizations are increasingly under pressure to prove sort of the metrics and the impact value of the money that they invest. And even as we're still figuring out what the heck a like means in a material sense, there is a sense that it does represent something. And so it does not replace having a good idea or a strong budget. But it is a complement to those things, right? And so increasingly, I actually now think through those types of issues now with every grant application that I do. The same thing with publishers. As I was talking to publishers about the book project, it was conceiving of the book as part of a larger ecosystem of a public conversation. And that absolutely went into the book proposal. And again, feedback from the publisher was that that was important to them investing in the book. Right? Not just taking the contract, which is one thing, but investing in it, which increasingly I'm learning are two different things, right? Which was that they would put resources behind promoting it, packaging it, publishing it, because they thought I had already done some of that work. So those are some of the ways in that crossover, I think, has resonated with my academic research. And then a couple of things that Julie said that I thought was fabulous. So one of the sort of parallel tracks that developed for me as I was doing this work is increasingly I consult also with organizations, usually nonprofits and academic institutions about social media and public scholarship. And I love the example of if you are not online, it's at the point now, if anybody remembers phone books, I know you may not, depending on which. I'm not that person to say that. You still remember those landing on your doorstep, and you looking for somebody to come do a service on your house, and the plumber wasn't in the phone book, it wasn't a plumber. You didn't care whether he came by the house with flyers or a card. Increasingly, that's what a social media profile is. Yes, we know you exist, but we're not sure under what conditions you exist. If you're not there, you're not in the phone book. Now, that does not necessarily mean, I know that I think sometimes my engagement in public spaces overwhelms people, but I'm kind of like the case that you gave. I would be there anyway, right? Retrofitting it for my academic engagement is not an extra, is not a burdensome task for me. But if it is for you, which is just fine, by the way, I tell them this all the time, it's okay that you don't really want to be there, right? You don't have to manage it to the same level that some of us do, but you do need to be there. And that really is as simple as putting an ad in the phone book used to be. A LinkedIn profile, a Google Plus profile do not have to be managed constantly, but it will say that you're there. And there are all kinds of tools that you can use that will sort of aggregate content and sort of keep those pages active without you doing that on a daily basis or even on a weekly basis. Often if I know I'm going to be absent for a long time, which right now there's a little thing called a dissertation happening in my life, I am absent for huge chunks of time, but I was still responsible for some other relationships. I was co-organizing a panel with some colleagues that I couldn't join them for physically. I can set up and schedule my participation in a lot of those events, right? I can use those tools so I don't have to be there personally managing, sharing content. I think that using social media as an archival tool is a great strategy for doing precisely that. I actually use it that way myself. A lot of my sources are things, I use my feed to do precisely that kind of filtering of information that people find overwhelming about being on Twitter. In particular, I think Facebook a little less so, but you use your feed, if you curate the people you follow fairly carefully, they are my filter for information. These are people I share some interest with, some professional location with. If they found it interesting, chances are excellent I will too. I use then Twitter to archive it, right? I can send it to my reading list if I'm mobile. If I'm on my desktop, I save it to Digo. It's there. I go through it, try to set aside time every once in a while to search through that stuff. Even if I never search through it, I know it's there, and that gives me actually a lot of comfort. I don't know. It might just be me. I like knowing it exists. That's right. It's there. That's right. And I can't tell you how often I actually search through those files as I was working on the dissertation and the book, and continue to do that. But now more broadly, so if you're not the type who would be in those spaces naturally, again, one, I'd like to give you permission to not be. That's perfectly acceptable. But second, if you still feel you need to have a placeholder there, which I would strongly encourage you to do, then think about it as anything else that you have to manage. Outsource what you can, whether that be the digital tools that automate it, to people who can share that space with you. You don't need to have your own blog when there's so many popping up in professional organizations, particularly in higher education, of people who already have blogs. Just contribute to theirs, right? There's so many spaces. I think of orgtheory.com. The U.S. Intellectual History Organization has a really active online presence, and it's a collective of people in that profession, and they share that platform. So you're not responsible for constant production or management. So collaborate, quite frankly, and honestly, having the excuse to collaborate with people across the academic hierarchy, because social media brings you together, is one of the most beautiful things about it. I'm in conversation with people that I've never would have been in conversations with before at this point in my career, and it has led to almost countless really academic opportunities and professional opportunities and great friends. Every social media website has different levels of control over your privacy, your visibility, your platform affordances. If you're managing your profile in that kind of way, think about those things, what information you'll share where, right, under what conditions. And that way, if you make those decisions up front, you're less likely to run into issues of the wrong content, starting sort of an online flame war. If you spend a little time at the front end being a little deliberate about what you will or will not do, it can eventually sort of run itself.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.